Welcome to The Road. This is a weekly podcast of All Saints Lutheran Church. I'm your host, John Pedersen, and I serve as pastor. Each week, we reflect on faith, life, and navigating the road ahead. The language of journey is common when we think about life. It has its joys and challenges along the way, and we all need a little encouragement and guidance at times to keep us going. There's a word in the Bible, asphalia, which means truth, but it's the same root word we use in English for asphalt, if you can believe that. It's a solid surface that makes travel easier and more assured. And so every week we're going to be exploring elements of faith and life that keep us on the road. Faith isn't about living a perfect life. It's about finding our way, getting through rough spots, but seeking out those great vistas too. You can find my weekly message here, but you'll also find special conversations with guests who have insights on things like wellness, parenting, and living with unique purpose. If you appreciate this podcast, remember to subscribe where possible and share it with a friend. Here's this week's message. So again, thanks for joining us as we begin this Lenten journey. Ash Wednesday obviously is a bit more of a solemn service that invites us to reflect on sin and death. Not the most inspiring themes on the surface, but my hope is that we'll come to appreciate the value of revisiting these themes. During February, we had a study on the ancient practice of Sabbath. The Sabbath comes from God resting from creation, and it's a pattern that God then directs people to take up, to rest, but also to find contentment one day each week. Sabbath might not be the first thing that comes to mind when you think of Ash Wednesday, but I think there are some parallels. Without Sabbath, we keep on working. We keep striving. We're afraid of losing out to competition or from simply feeling unproductive. We keep accelerating with no stop or pause. And in fact, we come so used to this that we become afraid of stopping despite exhaustion. Our economic system relies on growth and acceleration. So to stop feels almost like a risk, not just to the projects that we're working on, but somehow to ourselves in a kind of existential way. Norman Wiersbe, who is a professor of theology at Duke Divinity School, says the real target of Sabbath rest is not just stopping, but figuring out what to do with the restlessness. The restlessness he's talking about is that when we rest and pause from work and striving, it forces us to reflect on the meaning of life and our own place in it all. That can feel a little bit uncomfortable, but it invites us to find a deeper sense of identity and peace that is distinct from what we accomplish or what we become. And that's a gift. And so when we remember the gift of God's love for us and our identity as children of God, facing our vulnerability head on allows us to find a new foundation and sense of assurance that can bring us peace. It actually frees us. And that's what Ash Wednesday is about. It's about facing up to our restlessness with our own limits and shortcomings and discovering that while sobering, it gives us a more genuine grounding to experience new life. Surveys have shown that half of Americans believe in the concept of manifesting. This is the idea that thoughts can directly shape reality. It's essentially a progression from the old power of positive thinking. There's an element of truth in this, like many things. A good attitude certainly makes a difference. But this isn't just about optimism and adopting a success mindset. It's about the belief that human thoughts and desires can literally reshape reality. Philosopher Byung-Chul Han warns that this obsession with positive thinking and self-optimization comes at a cost. The constant pressure to perform, to project success and strength creates what Han calls a performance society. If we fail, our identity and meaning collapses. The message of Ash Wednesday is a reality check to this. Remember that you are dust, and to dust you shall return. If we don't acknowledge this, we might prefer to just deny pain in ourselves or others. It's only real if we allow it to be. Just keep pressing on, keep your blinders on. Acknowledging pain or suffering only gets in the way of an optimistic mindset on the way to success. Harvard Medical School psychologist Susan David talks about the ways that we can end up in a kind of tyranny of positivity this way when we're confronted with suffering or loss of some kind. When she was a teen, her father, who was 42 at the time, died of colon cancer. He died on a Friday, and she went to school on Monday because her mom wanted to keep things normal, and she was dealing with her own grief. And she remembers that her entire class for months avoided talking about fathers in her presence because there was this idea that it would somehow make her upset. She says, "So I started to experience a massive avoidance around difficult emotions, and when people started to say to me, 'How are you doing?' I would say, 'I'm doing fine.' I was praised for being strong. I didn't drop a single grade, and I almost started to believe that the world really valued the idea of me being positive as a proxy for me coping well. But in truth, I was 15 years old grieving my dad. I became bulimic. I was unable to bear the weight of my grief. My mother was raising 3 children. The creditors were knocking. But every day I would go to school and I would have the smile on my face. And one day, there was a teacher who handed out these blank notebooks to the class. And she said, 'Write. Tell the truth. Write like no one is reading.' And it was the most extraordinary invitation by this individual who, instead of saying, 'Just be positive, everyone's got to be positive, good vibes only,' was someone who was saying, 'You know, I see you. I know that that's not your emotional truth.'" Susan David says that her teacher invited her into ongoing correspondence, and she started to experience the profound healing and resilience that came through moving to difficult emotions. By finally confronting her father's death head on, it allowed her to heal and find new life and ultimately purpose. For almost a half century, theologian Douglas John Hall has noted that in North America, we've historically struggled with the incapacity to suffer because there's a strong tradition of denying anything negative. It's part of our drive to succeed. Suffering and vulnerability in ourselves and others is often treated as an illusion that people need to get over. But he notes that repressed suffering is paid for by those in proximity to it. Hall identifies 3 social consequences of repressing our suffering. First, it's difficult for most people to accept or articulate their own personal suffering. As a result, we cover up negative experiences and suppress emotions, the same thing that Susan David was talking about in her own life. That requires us to live in a state of denial about any negative realities in our own lives, and it can actually cause us more pain and suffering this way. It can prevent us from getting the help we need and lead to self-destructive patterns in the long term. A second consequence of the inability to suffer or acknowledge suffering is the inability of so many to enter imaginatively into the suffering of others. We distance ourselves from the pain of others. Someone I know in recent years who was going through the long-term illness of a family member remarked that many friends didn't come around anymore. If they bumped into someone they knew at the store, it was a brief, uncomfortable encounter. The other person didn't know what to say or how to be with them in any meaningful way in their difficult experience. And so, rather than their community being a source of support and strength, it became isolating. The third consequence is what Hall describes as the most alarming of all: the search for an enemy. Hall says it belongs to the psychic state of a people which cannot consciously confront its own suffering, yet cannot avoid absolutely the shock of non-being, that it is driven to look elsewhere for the source of its trouble. Every empire needs its enemy in order to avoid facing up to the internal flaws in its own triumphant self-image. Avoidance and denial can certainly be a coping mechanism in the short term. But Hall concludes that it's not suffering itself, but the incapacity to suffer and to acknowledge, accept, and articulate it that leaves the greatest damage. Acknowledging suffering, however, is just the first step. Suffering is not inherent in creation, and it's only part of the truth. And this is where the hope of Ash Wednesday emerges. There's also the truth of God's love and care for us. In Jesus, we see that God is making all things new. God is redeeming humanity. God is able to bring new life in spite of sin and suffering and death. Forgiveness and new life are our inheritance as followers of Jesus. When we allow ourselves to confront our restlessness head on and to acknowledge our frailty and our failings, the grace and love of God can finally become relevant and real for us. When you fail and life does not work out the way you expected and dreamed it to be, you're left with a more grounded reality about your existence. Your identity is less fixed on accomplishments and success, but on your identity and relationship to God, to other people, and to this world that we live in. You are forgiven and promised new life. We can be authentic. God's grace doesn't make us into something else, but makes us the self that we are before God. When we embrace this new way of being human before God, we are a new creation. And so on this Ash Wednesday and during this season of Lent, be assured that through your own baptism, God has claimed you as a child of God. God's love and promises to us are real. May this assurance give you courage to acknowledge your reality, change in yourself and in the world what you can, and emerge more hopeful and more assured of God's love and calling for you. Amen. That's this week's message. You don't have to navigate the road ahead alone. You can join with others at All Saints. Visit allsaintsmtka.org for more information. Have a great week.